Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Joshua Jerson for this one. Amy plays an Invoke Calamity, and as it's resolving, she wants to cast a Shock and a Sudden Shock. Is it possible for her to cast both of these spells in such a way that nobody can counter either one of them? Alright, so first of all, let's take a look at the comprehensive rules definition for Split Second, and we can see exactly how it functions. As long as the spell with Split Second is on the stack, then players cannot cast other spells and they cannot activate any activated abilities. So that would mean that if Amy is able to maneuver the game into such a state where the Sudden Shock is on the stack and the Shock is on top of it, then the Shock would resolve first and the Sudden Shock would resolve afterwards, and the entire time that happens, a Split Second spell is on the stack, which means that nobody is able to cast any other spells, which obviously aligns very well with Amy's goal of not getting either one of her spells countered. Now the question arises, is it possible for Amy to maneuver the game into such a state? Now, let's take a look at the exact wording on Invoke Calamity, and we can see that we've got something kind of interesting, which is that we have the word cast associated with two spells. Now we only use the word cast once, and ordinarily when you see a single action word associated with a set containing multiple objects, then you would expect to see that action being taken on all of those objects at the same time. However, because it's not really possible to cast multiple spells at the same time, that means that Amy, the person who's doing that action, is going to get to choose what order that she affects each of those objects. And so putting that into the concrete terms of this example, we can see that that really seems like it's going to help Amy out a lot. She gets to choose the order that she casts those spells. And so that would mean that if she's able to choose the order of casting Sudden Shock and then casting Shock, then she would be able to get into that game state we talked about and everything would be good for her. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a problem with that. If we bring back up the wording for Split Second, we can see that it applies to all players. In other words, nobody is able to cast any spells other than the Split Second spell as long as the Split Second spell is on the stack. Now, that means that after Amy casts the Sudden Shock, then the spell with Split Second is going to be on the stack, and she's not going to be able to cast any other spells. Fortunately for her, this is a totally valid way to resolve the Invoke Calamity, because Invoke Calamity says that you can cast up to 2 spells. Of course, this is probably not what Amy had in mind, because she's only going to be able to cast 1 spell. It would, of course, be possible for her to cast the Shock first and then the Sudden Shock on top of that, but then, after the Sudden Shock resolves, her opponent would be able to play a counterspell since there's no longer a spell with Split Second on the stack. If Amy wanted to play 2 spells that had Split Second with an Invoke Calamity, well, of course, this wouldn't really be possible for the reason that we talked about just now. Amy's just going to have to cast the 2 spells in the non-optimal order because it's the only legal one, and hope for the best. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.